All right. So the book I wrote, if you've heard it, and even if you haven't, is basically sort of understanding Rails by looking at one system of Rails at a time. A lot of the things that are kind of magical in Rails make a lot more sense once you build them, because when you've seen the Ruby features they're built on, you know there's only a couple of ways to do it. So this is one of those. This is one thing Rails does with how you build it in Ruby. We'll go over code naturally. Yeah. So, most people in this room probably know about method missing. If you call the method that's not there, call the method missing, you're allowed to do something, you're allowed to find a new method in response. You can do whatever you want in response, but calls method missing, you do something, you move on with your life. So that's nice. It turns out Ruby has a slightly lesser known feature called constant missing that does the same kind of thing with constants instead of methods. And it turns out further that class names in Ruby are just constants. So the first thing you want to know about how you go without requires is, you know, how do you not immediately raise an exception and die as soon as you hit a class name that doesn't run. So constant missing. Just look at how that works. If you didn't want to raise an exception, you can just not raise an exception in constant missing, and that works. So here in the class object, I define the self.constant missing, and I do a std.puts, and then I have a class that isn't defined anywhere down underneath it. And if you run this, you will get that std.puts. You'll get that print console that I did. But you won't get an exception raised because you had a constant missing. You didn't raise an exception. So okay, that means if there's a class name that you use that it doesn't know yet, that's where you can run code for it. It's a good start. You can also make a class. If you're going to load the class has to exist somewhere. I say bobo.rb in the same directory, basically, so that, you know, with the class name being about the same as the file name, you're going to want to be able to look it up from that. Part of with the Rails class loading that I assume people here already know is you have to have the class and the file have the same name so that Rails has some idea where to look for it. So we're going to do that same trick in roughly that same way. Okay, we make a file with the same name. We have a class that does one thing so we can tell if it's loaded or not. That's fine. So what should const missing do to return this class if it's not already loaded?
Auto-load?
Well, one thing you could do is to define an autoload for it. Yeah, autoload, for those who don't already know, is a feature built into Ruby that does the same kind of thing. When you use a constant, then it will load the file for it, and you know then you can use it. It's the same idea as catch the exception, you know, and load it. It turns out if you're already using const missing, though, you don't necessarily have to use autoload. Though you could. Autoload would absolutely work. You could run through the directory, and you could register it with autoload. That would be another perfectly good solution to this same problem. That's not what I'm going to do today, but it works. What I would do here is, if it gets const missing, then you can require relative the file, and then what you can return is that same thing. So this obviously is a little bit limited. It will keep getting less limited as the slides go on. This is just working for Bobo. But you can require the file, and then if you give the name of the class, what happens is that a class is just a thing in Ruby that you can pass around, same as anything else. So when I say Bobo as the return value at the end of const missing there, you're returning a new class. And so it looks for a constant. Constant doesn't exist. Const missing is called. Thing that is returned is a class, and now it works as a class. Also, we did the require, and so the next time it tries to use that constant, it's not even going to go through const missing. We've already defined it. It's going to use it. So that's cute. I mentioned for require versus require relative here, because in this problem you hit it pretty quickly. Actually, show of hands. Do people here already know require versus require relative? Is this completely old hat to everybody?
No, it's good to get.
Okay. So when you require, you've got a list of files that Ruby already knows to look through. It's called the load map. If you pop into IRB or into Ruby, you look for $load_path in all caps. It turns out that's the list of directories that it looks through. When you require, it'll look through all of those things. It won't necessarily look in the current directory. In current Ruby, it doesn't even have the current directory in the load path. So if you put something in the current directory and you require it, Ruby won't actually find it, unless you add it to the load path.
Oh, I just want to mention that one other distinction between require is the require actually is where the Ruby process was started. It's going to look from relative to where the Ruby process was started, whereas the require relative looks for
from
relative to the directory where that file is. Like this is very
Well, sorry, so require relative uses the current working
Current
directory,
working
which starts out as being wherever you were, whatever was the
If you
current
start
working directory.
putting in some other directory, it would actually still consider from that directory instead of where the actual Ruby process
But
was
the
started.
load path is usually absolute paths. The load path is usually a set of paths which doesn't depend where you started from. And so require normally actually works the same no matter where you started from. But yes, require relative is looking from, sorry, not from the current working directory, from the, from where the binary is. You're right. So yes, require relative basically means relative to this current file. Have people here been programming long enough, you remember the horrible workaround people used to use for this? Where you
File that, expand path and all that.
Okay, not that horrible workaround. Double underscore file, double underscore, and you take the dir name of it to get the directory, and then you use file.join between that and the
You can
thing.
still see it's those constructs in some of the Ruby gems, right?
Yeah, oh yeah, a lot of them still have it, because if you're going to support Ruby before require relative, which is funny, it's old now, but some people still do. Yeah, you have to do your own surgery on double underscore file, double underscore, back before there was double underscore dir, double underscore. Okay, anyway, so require is going to look in your list of load paths. It doesn't matter where you're doing it from. Require relative looks relative to the current file. If what you have is you want to automatically load a class that you know is in the code next to your current file, require relative is usually the right answer. Rails actually just has a little list of paths that it looks through. It automatically, loads things from your controller directory. It automatically loads things from your models directory. It doesn't automatically do it from your lib directory, which is why you have to require those files if you want them even in Rails. But you could add that, and if you do add that directory, then Rails will load it. So, I guess we're done. Just require the class name? Almost. Almost, not quite. Because if you do it this way, and then you try it with that Bobo thing, and you do it on, anything other than Mac pretty much, you will discover that capital B Bobo.rb doesn't exist on your file system. So it'll try to load it, but there's no file there with that name. Or if you do something with, mixed caps, you'll discover that when you put underscores in the file name, that's not there on your file system either. So almost, we're getting there. It looks for the wrong file name, but we're close. By the way, the other thing that I put here is object.constget. So Ruby cheerfully gives you hooks into the interpreter for almost everything. Pretty much anything Ruby will do for you, it's got some way that you can do it for yourself, even if you aren't using eval, but of course you can use eval to do it. If you were to eval this, do people know eval? No? Shake heads? Eval? Yes? No? Okay, I see some yes and some no. So eval basically means you've got a string in Ruby that's Ruby code, so go ahead and run it as Ruby code. Usually the Ruby code you run is not a string at the time you run it. If you've got a Ruby string from somewhere, like you load it in a file yourself or something, you can eval it and it works. So if you eval something like Bobo here, then what it'll do is it'll say, oh, this thing is called Bobo, it's Ruby code. What does that mean? Oh, it gets the constant. If you don't want to open yourself to hideous security problems, because eval is nothing if not a fountain of horrible security problems, instead of letting them run any Ruby code they want, you could say, actually, you know what, here's a constant name. Just get me the constant. Don't run arbitrary Ruby code.
So it's kind of like IRB, right? They're beginners are familiar with IRB. They just type in code, it works, right? So eval is something that takes the string and just executes it.
Yeah. It turns out you can build IRB in 15 lines or something, pretty much about just running eval in a type loop. Yeah. The hard part of IRB is figuring out when they've finished typing stuff, and you can go ahead and eval it. But if you just let them do single line, so if you don't let them do multi-line, turns out IRB is this much code. Because what you do is you keep asking for a string, and then you eval it, and do it as many times as you want. And if you were terrible, what you could do is try to eval it, and if you get an error, then look for another line. You could do it JavaScript style. And when I say JavaScript style, I hope everyone in here feels that little shudder of revulsion. At least on line endings. It's not that JavaScript has no good points. Its line endings are not one of the good points. Anyway, constget. So Ruby has a bunch of little hooks like constget, where you can get a constant. It has a bunch of other little hooks where you can define a method. It has hooks for all the stuff. This is the one we're using here. So yeah, I mentioned that if you were looking for something called myClass, it doesn't successfully look for my_class.rb. So that problem I mentioned, yep. So how do we go from myClass in mixed caps to my_class.rb? And you can skip the RB because require will automatically check for that. But we want to convert. So active support. Do people here know active support? Yes. Okay. Cool. I assume so in a Rails talk, but I'd like to ask. So I just stole this next function from active support because it turns out that Rails is beautifully small and terse and well tested, and usually the first thing you should do if you've got code you know Rails has is just to steal it. And the licensing is permissive, so that helps too. So here's what Rails uses for this. I could hit right arrow again while all of you are in the middle of parsing a regular expression, but I'm not that cruel. So let's talk about what it does. Turns out it does a little bit more than we need. So the gsub : with slash. This to underscore thing is very Rails specific. Turns out you're not going to give it anything with a : because your class names aren't going to have modules in them. People know about modules and scoping the modules with : I see some nodding and no head shaking yet. Cool. So we're probably not going to do that, but if we did, they'd kind of like it to look in a subdirectory. : becomes slash in the name. Sure, cool. Gsub can love these regular expressions. Capital A to Z, one or more, followed by a single capital and then a lowercase, turns into the first thing in parentheses underscore the second thing in parentheses. That is the magic that actually makes this go. Wow, nobody either looks completely thunderstruck or like they're just annoyed. All right, stop me as soon as you guys get bored. I can explain this all day, and you don't want me to. If you've got a bunch of uppercase, but then you've got an uppercase followed by a lowercase, then what you want to do is break it with the underscore, sort of like for my class, capital my, capital class. You want to break it right before that last capital letter. So what that's doing is break it into two and put the underscore in between right before that last capital letter. One thing it doesn't do is it doesn't convert it to lowercase, but we'll get there. And then along the same general lines, if you've got a bunch of lowercase and then a number and then an uppercase, they put an underscore here too. I actually recommend playing around with this in IRB. It's kind of cool. I like taking these things and using them individually. IRB is a great way to play with this. Do you have to do it that way? Not necessarily. One of the cool things about, do people know the phrase snake case and camel case? Did I say that? People know? Okay, I see them nodding. Good. One of the cool things about converting back and forth between snake case and camel case is everybody does it a little bit differently. So if you have a whole bunch of stuff to convert and you're doing it in multiple languages, you find out where the edge cases are by what completely fails to compile when you're done. Not that I've done that or anything. But yeah, so they like the idea that a number kind of sort of counts as lowercase, and the \d is basically a number in regular expressionese. And so they treat it as that, and if you've got lowercase or numbers followed by uppercase, then they do the separation.
No. Why do we have TR? What can't we use gsub instead of TR?
TR. You can use gsub instead of TR, given that this is very in depths of Rails, and Rails takes a lot of flack for being slow. They tend to do stuff that's fast wherever they can. One thing about TR is it actually builds a little character class and a mapping, and so it winds up being much, much faster than gsub with a regular expression, like far faster. Couldn't you do it with gsub and have some sort of fun caching thing work? My guess, given the way the Rails guys work, is they probably tried it and found TR was faster, but I have not dug through the actual commits of Rails where this happened, so I can't tell you for sure. If it's old enough, maybe they did.
So usually this TR is faster than gsub.
Yes, TR is a much more specialized tool and it tends to run faster. Absolutely, when you're just mapping from one to the other. And if that's not already obvious to you, you have led a wonderful and blessed life. May it continue so. It's the kind of thing where if you don't have a reason to know it, I'm so glad to hear you don't. Anyway, but it just translates, one character to another character. And then, at the end, it calls downcase. And speaking of line endings, it's Ruby, so anytime that we do the dot and the dot and the dot, it'll cheerfully keep parsing anytime it has to get a parse error or continue.
The downcase is probably another active support method, I guess.
No, that's actually built into Ruby proper.
Okay.
That's a standard string method. Yeah. And there's a similar, like DC first or something, just the first character. But yeah, downcase is standard Ruby string. Cool. So, do people think that this is obvious enough or unimportant enough we should move on, or do we want to spend a little time in IRB seeing how this actually converts camel case to snake case?
Oh, we could look at the unit test, maybe in the hospital.
We could look at, they have a bunch of unit tests. Tell you what, I'll put that to the end, we'll see if people are interested in that at the end. Okay, so put it all together. So this code here actually does what I mentioned. This is the code that actually implements that thing I asked as the title of the talk. How do you do it? So require relative to underscore. You can also stick that code right at the beginning of the file. Whatever works, knock yourself out. Class object, self const missing. So then we call to underscore on the stringified version of that symbol. We do a require relative on the snake case version of it. We do a const get on the converted to camel case version of it, and that's good. So when we then put bobo.new.print bobo, if we've got a bobo.c, then it will cheerfully load it, and then it will call this. So all of this does, in fact, do that. And if you like, let me pop the font size up substantially, so it's completely invisible at that size. But we'll go ahead and run it, because I'm a nice enough guy and all, but I assume you don't just trust me to give you random Ruby code and have it work. So let's look at const missing, which should look an awful lot like what you just saw on that slide. Require relative to underscore, class object, self const missing. And so here's that bobo class. And then if we run const missing, we get bobo. And then, because how do you know I didn't do it completely wrong? Give me another name. Somebody yell another name.
Fubar.
Fubar. Then if we run it again, we get Bobo and Fubar. So unless he was a Confederate planet in the audience and I already knew what he was going to say, then it worked and it...
I didn't bribe it.
All right, so that is basically the answer to how do I do that. So, another fine question you might have at this point. I know I always have this question at almost every point in almost every presentation. Why do I care? So let's talk about why you care. Const missing is sort of fun. Const missing is a cute feature. You may use it in some other capacity. But more importantly, const missing is limited, and sometimes it screws up. If any of you have had that wonderful experience in Rails where it tries to load something and just completely fails to find it in one way or another, and you get those problems where you used a class and you went, this is Rails, you're supposed to load all of this for me, you're giving me random class not defined errors, my class is defined, why? Then you run into some of the limits in const get and Rails approach and all of that various stuff. And sometimes you find a typo, and like almost any other time you find a typo in Rails, you go, oh, I don't know how any of this works, but I'll fix the typo, and if it works magically, then we're good again. But more to the point, by seeing this implementation of it and realizing that what it does is take that name you gave it and convert it to snake case and look in the list of directories that it knows, you will know that if something goes wrong, one, you have to have the name right. Two, it has to convert correctly between snake case and camel case. And one of the things you'll discover if you do pop this into IRB is, as with it doing things with numbers, your idea of how it should convert and its idea of how it should convert may be a little bit different. And three, it's got to be looking in a directory where it can actually find it. So if you have this problem where you use a class name and you can't find it, you can't find it, you can't find it, and you manually add a require to a lib directory, what you have found is a limit of which directories Rails automatically adds to that list for you. And if you complain to a more experienced Rails programmer, they went and added a magic line to a magic config file, and suddenly that directory is in your list, and you remember somewhere in the back of your mind, okay, if I ever have this problem again, I must never switch jobs at ActionSpot. But
no, what does the constant get doing?
So const get basically means look in the current scope and find a constant with that name. So it's effectively doing an eval. It's just a very limited eval that just gets a constant value. So here, let's
You can
pop
also
it
do a
up.
const set, right?
Yes, there's const set as well, which does exactly the corresponding thing with the set here. Let's pop into IRB. So I always forget the names of these things. And so one of the probably the most important thing I can teach you here goes like this. I'm about to type something here, and so I'll just say self.methods, and it'll tell me all the methods that are defined here. And I will, of course, say, that's a lot of methods, and I really don't read that fast. Will this be useful? This is not terribly useful. But what you can do if you're curious about a given thing and how you can call it, one, you can call .methods, and two, you can subtract off the methods that are defined on object and see what it does that object does not. Is that useful? Here, let me show you one. And I like them in alphabetical order, so I hold on to it. You do you. How is that useful? Here's all the stuff that you can call on an empty array that you can't call on object. So I find that kind of thing useful. You can also call it on a parent class if you're curious. What's all the stuff I can call on an empty array that I can't call on enumerable? The answer is probably going to be almost nothing. And we've got a few things that enumerable doesn't do, but we can call on an empty array. Anyway, So yeah, one of the joys of Ruby is that in the same way that you can call const get to get constants and const missing to respond to a missing constant and all the other hooks into the interpreter, some of the hooks into the interpreter are, what are all the methods on this object? Because Ruby doesn't really have a compile time. I mean, if you guys notice, technically there's parsing, but if you're in the middle of a class and you have a def there, you can just put an if around it. And if the if is false, it doesn't get defined. Because, defining a method would be something sort of compile time in almost any other language. But in Ruby, like, no, it's just running along, and if you say, if something around it is false, you never get to that, because why would you? It's all runtime. In the same way, if you get in there and you're looking at classes and you want to add new methods to it at runtime, you can totally do that. And so if you're an IRB, like, just grab a list of methods and then sort them and then mess with them. Of course you do. Anyway, so yeah, and then we were talking about we were talking about const get. So yeah, this should be there isn't one, and that'll. Oh no.
What if you do const get string, built-in object?
You do in fact get that, and in fact.
Yes, that will be built-in string object class.
Yeah, which is a string of type class, and there are a few things that you can do. And there are a few things you can do to make sure that you are looking at a specific and unique object. Do people already know object IDs? Is that a Ruby thing people already know? Cool. I know there are some folks who are nodding along, and I apologize. I'll happily go over some more advanced topics for you folks at the end if you like. But I do like making sure that we've covered the good basic stuff in IRB. So when we say object const get string, a lot of the constants that you get automatically in Ruby are the classes. When you pop into IRB, what constants are already defined? Well, a lot of them are classes. Makes sense. You can also say constants, which will give you a list of all of those. And then if you're me, you would sort them alphabetically because the jacket list I can never. But if you want to know what constants are available on object in Ruby, there's a whole bunch of answers to that question here. Argf, argv, argumenter, array, basic object. Some of these aren't classes. It's not all classes. That's nice. Oh, and did you mean, which is now built into Ruby. Didn't used to be, but now did you mean is built into Ruby, which is part of the reason that you see it constantly in IRB and in your various stat traces where you make a typo. All right. So you asked about const get, and so yeah, for any of these, if what you want is to see what's going on with that, you can figure out what it is and what type it is. Type error is a subclass of standard error, is what I'm showing there by saying, what is it? It's a class. What's its superclass? Standard error. And you can also ask it questions like, what instance methods does it define? So if you had an instance of that type, what could you call on it? You can also just make an instance of that type in most cases and then say, I've got this object, what can I call on it? But I like having the instance methods thing because sometimes they make it hard to guess the constructor arguments.
You were trying to do ID and you got error message, right?
Yep.
My guess is this __ ID, would that work?
Yes, yeah, ID was an old alias for it. I'm an old guy. I was remembering the old way you used to do it. The ID with the underscores works, and object _ ID is the right way to do it. The problem with the .id is that you have all kinds of conflicts with things like active record, which is why you may remember the terrible old Rails bug where you get a nil and you'd call .id on something without checking for nil, and hey, yes, yes, and it's because in Ruby, the object ID of nil is, it's 8. Yeah, it's 4. Yeah, they changed the bit flags. On us. But yes, it was 4 for the longest time, and so you'd call .id on something in Rails when you actually hadn't gotten anything, and .id gave you the object ID of nil, which used to be 4. Cool. All right. So that's the basics of how this feature works. And again, the why do you care is basically to debug it if something goes wrong. One thing that's worth mentioning is that, of course, Rails console. People here already know Rails console, right? Yeah. Good. Okay. Rails console, which is certainly your IRB equivalent here, go in and type random class names that do or don't exist, and you can find out pretty quick if Rails can find it. Doesn't always work for things like views, but it should certainly work for your models and your controllers. And again, if it doesn't, then something's wrong in what you typed, or the directories that it's looking through, or any of the same things that you would need to know to do the const-get. The only reason I don't say read through the Rails code for this, though you can, it's not a bad thing to do, is that the Rails const-get spends an awful lot of its time looking through modules and subdirectories of your app and trying to guess if you've got thing nested under thing, which one you meant, which one it should load. One of the reasons that the error messages are so bad when Rails is just completely unable to guess what file to load for you is that it's trying to figure out this complicated module-based approach, whether you actually use anything like that or not. Cool.
Is this a Rails 4 or is this Rails 5?
This is just IRB. This is
Oh,
just
IRB.
So the code I gave in here doesn't require Rails to run because, of course, Rails is already doing its own object.const-get. If you run this like this under Rails, it will blow away the old object.const-get because you just define a new one. And this is Ruby, so last one, the monkey patch wins. This is basically if you want to implement the same kind of thing without using active support for your own thing. Why might you want to not use active support? Because, oh man, the dependency graph for active support is brittle. Because occasionally it has a feature that you want, but you don't really want to have the kind of dependencies that active support does because they're extensive. But this would be if you were going to do a Sinatra-like framework, but you did want to, to automatically require it instead of requiring them to manually require like actual Sinatra. I'm a big fan of the idea that Rails is a fine web framework, and whatever the next really good Ruby web framework is going to steal a lot of features from it. So I try to make it as easy as possible for people out here to steal features from Rails. Cool. And I think that's as much useful as I've already got planned on this topic. There's a blog post that I've got that goes through this exact same thing. I'm going to post the slides on the Meetup group. There's also a blog post that goes into a little bit more detail on my blog, and that in turn is based on a chapter in the book. Don't buy the book just for this chapter. The blog post is great. Yeah. Any other questions on this topic before we move on to, we have a couple of other suggested random topics. I'm happy to do whatever.
Probably something I noticed, maybe a question to the group. In Rails 4, I believe you could do a Rails console -- simple -prompt to drop you without giving those extra version information and stuff.
Oh, no,
But in Rails 5.1, I believe it's broken. So that's why I was asking what version of Rails you were using.
Yeah, this is just straight up IRB.
Yeah. Maybe it's a regression bug. I don't know if anybody else has encountered.
Yeah, I mean, when in doubt, file a bug. Bugs with a reproduction case, and that sounds like a really easy reproduction case. Yeah, bugs with a reproduction case tend to get looked at pretty quick.
Because if you do IRB -- simple prompt, if you do that, that's essentially the same thing Rails was doing. Boom. See?
Okay. Yeah.
The only difference was we had to give a hyphen before this hyphen after simple prompt. So Rails.
Yeah, I don't have that.
This seems to be like a Rails 3.2. This will work on Rails 3.2 probably. Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah, well, I just realized that for Rails console, I should have a Rails app sitting around already properly configured. And while I've got a couple of Rails apps sitting around, they're not configured to the right console at the moment, so I can't easily go in and check. This is a problem doing all my benchmarking on EC2. It doesn't actually run very well locally. Speaking of which, if anybody here was looking for a Rails benchmark, isn't everyone? Don't you spend all of your time year by year looking around for the right Rails benchmark? I've been spending a lot of time writing on the Appfolio company blog about this benchmark and the changes in speed for Rails for various Ruby versions and things like that. If you've been looking for something to heckle, I mean, we all love to heckle, right? Doesn't everyone love to? There are graphs. You can heckle the graphs, and there's source code. You can find something to heckle. This I promise. You can go have a look, and I would love your comments on all the things I forgot to do when attempting to time Rails. And this is a room full of programmers. Not only can someone here tell me that I've forgotten something benchmarking-wise, I believe every person here can tell me something I'm doing wrong. This is a talent programmers have. I have faith that every one of you can tell me something I'm doing wrong. Unfortunately, 75% of you will pick the same thing the first time, but we'll move past that. All right, cool. So I have a lot more questions on this topic. The two, sort of free-form questions I got early on when asking was, what's new in Rails? Sort of a 5-1 one down. What I'll say for that immediately is there's a really good one that Claudio did at the most recent RailsConf, and if you're willing to wait a few more days, confreaks.tv will have it up, and his version is going to be a lot better with real preparation than mine was. For the record, almost any talk at RailsConf is going to be better than most talks anywhere else, with the exception of talks given by the same people. But they're very solid quality talks. More to the point, he knew he was going to be talking about that. I didn't know I was.
When that comes out, can you post it to the group?
Sure, yeah. And I'll make sure for anybody who doesn't already know.
One more thing, Noah's article that he has been developing for the past 3 months. If you're on Peter Cooper's Ruby mailing list, he actually goes through all the really good links for the link, and he sends out a newsletter. And I've been seeing his articles in that newsletter. And Peter Cooper actually picks and tells you when exactly a YouTube video is available for free. Okay? And he gives an exact link to the YouTube channel. And
yeah, if you follow Ruby Weekly, he will certainly mention
Peter
when all the
Cooper,
Rails
if you follow
videos go
for
up.
his newsletter. That's how I actually keep up to date. I go through all the tutorials. Some of them work and some of them don't work. And I just document if I get something working. I just document it in my own blog. So just record it.
So for anybody who doesn't already know Confreaks, and I'm shocked I keep meeting people who don't, confreaks.tv here records in beautiful quality and great detail a ridiculously large number of different conferences. So click on the big Ruby there, because that's what they started with. But there's Mountain West Ruby Conference in 2013, actually, for the recent releases. Though there are certainly many, many, many old releases. So there's DevOps Days Seattle, are some of the ones that they've just put up. Because, RailsConf 2015, there we go for currently popular. The 2017s are coming. Again, those haven't popped because that was last week, but they will
I think
next
the
week.
2016 RailsConf videos, everything has been posted to YouTube. That's why you don't find it on
2016
Confreaks.
Yeah, normally they take about 2 weeks to post everything. So anything older than 2 weeks, is up there. But if you wanted to have your own little replay of any particular Ruby conf in recent years, they've got basically all of it recorded. Anyway, so if you have not found confreaks.tv, you can spend many happy hours there. If you have no idea what you would want to watch there, I recommend typing Avdi Grimm's name in and just watch anything he says. You'll decide very quickly if you like him, or Sandy Metz. You could type Sandy Metz's name, then you're even more likely to like anything she's got to say. Both of them are awesome. So, for Rails 5.1, that's a lot of it. Frankly, for Rails 5.1, my personal opinion, not backed by any particular slides, is there's a little bit there, there's a few fixes, there's a few optimizations. It's not a huge deal. Rails 5.1 is not a massive change. Rails 5.0 was a pretty solid change. You had things like action cable landing. You had some things that changed a lot. 5.1 was mostly a bug fix release. Solid bug fix release, nothing wrong with it, but nothing terribly huge.
JavaScript now hooks up with Node.js. You could use Webpacker to make use of the Node.js package manager for JavaScript libraries.
And as with anything else that touches the asset pipeline, I might wait a little bit for it to settle down and have some bugs fixed before you used it much. Sprockets took a while to settle, still is in some ways. Webpack's going to keep having some bugs for a while. It's good. Webpack is better than Sprockets. It is a step in the right direction. I might still wait for it to settle down.
I tried the Rails system test. It's supposed to run the Capybara on the browser.
Yep.
It's not working. Basically, I think it's a very bad decision that we decided to integrate Capybara into the Rails framework, mainly because Firefox just updates. It just decided I want to update. It just restarts itself. Okay.
Yeah.
That's it. Now Chrome driver is not compatible with the Firefox, and everything will go up. It was a very, very bad decision to actually make it browser driven and more focus given in that aspect. So a lot of people I opened a bug actually. Just created this new Rails 5.1 project and create a scaffold resource and then just run the generated system tag. Just crash, choke, run driver or something, choke, and that's it.
If you're curious why they made the choices they did, again, in the RailsConf talks, probably coming out next week, Eileen Michitelli had a great talk about Rails system test. She actually did an awful lot of the building, and she's a member of the Rails core team. And so if you'd like to tackle the design decisions in great detail, that talk is coming out next week.
It's not about the business decision, I just want it to work, you know. So things used to work when it came out of the box, you know.
Talking about capital, right? Saying things used to work coming out of the box is a little optimistic.
I expect things to work when it come out of the box. Now, like, this too much seems to be too much of a.
Yeah, they may switch to headless Chrome one of these days. I don't know. That'll work more often a little bit. Anyway, and the other thing I was asked about was embedded programming, with a specific question about performance and reliability.
Oh, no.
I can't tell if that's commentary on me. What I'll say primarily about evented programming is that if your particular problem looks like evented programming, nothing will do better than evented programming. And if your particular problem doesn't look like evented programming, oh God, don't touch it. Node.js is very, very good for particular things, and it's very, very bad for other things. Evented, what it actually does, have people here messed with like libEV or any of the low-level stuff that makes evented programming go?
No.
Okay. There are a couple of libraries that are used by pretty much all the evented libraries. It turns out Change is an underlying C library X Node.js, libEV, and that's fine. The big thing evented programming does.
What is it actually? Embedded programming? Never heard of that.
Okay, great. Fabulous question. Thank you. So evented programming, the interface to it that you usually see is if JavaScript style, you basically say, when a button is clicked, here's a function to call, or when somebody connects, do this. That's sort of the UI to it as a programmer. But the implementation under the hood that makes that practical to use is that it turns out there's a couple of really good C pooling libraries where you register those events with the C library and hand off control to its pooling loop so that it can handle thousands and thousands and thousands of connections that are mostly not doing much per connection. If you use the standard connection model that, say, Java would use, you wind up with a huge number of threads, and they're constantly, looking every so often, basically say, has anything happened yet? No, okay, go back to sleep. And so having many thousands of idle connections, even though they're not that expensive for each one, get expensive enough that 10,000 connections will sink you, because 10,000 connections is a lot. If you have this evented model, then you're not keeping a thread or any other sort of active thing messing with it. Instead, you hand off control pretty much completely to one evented loop that checks all 10,000 connections in one go. There are some restrictions on what you can do that with, but in a case where you can do that, and where few of your connections are doing much of anything, nothing is as efficient. Because, if you've got 9,500 connections doing nothing, you can really literally spend no resources on them. That's nice. So, evented programming. The old style of Unix programming that this kind of evolved from was you do everything with file descriptors, and you have probably the oldest system called to do this was called pull. And what you do is you'd say, here's my large number of file descriptors. I'm going to hand off to you. If any time in the next 5 seconds any of them have any activity, please call me back and leave a field set for which ones had something happen. And so you would do that if you had a vast number of network connections or a whole bunch of files open. And one of the joys of Unix file descriptors is you could use it for network connections and files open and several other things, so that if you just did everything through file descriptors, you could check them all at once, even if there were a lot of them. Evented programming is the same thing, but the sets of file descriptors are bigger. So in Node.js, it's the same kind of thing. You can basically say, here's my event handlers for everything. Anytime I get a connection, sure, open it. Do the least work I can possibly do. I'm not expecting this to do much of anything. Stick it in the big pool. Get it, stick it in the big pool. Get it, stick it in the big pool. And so, again, with Node.js, if what you're going to have is a huge number of connections, nothing else is as good. You don't want to spawn a thread for every one of those connections. You don't even really want to have a thread pool that keeps looking through those connections. You want to do nothing with the vast number of them doing nothing. And so for JavaScript, for browsers, for chat apps, where mostly it's going to be idle most of the time. Is anybody currently chatting on your site? Possibly not. And especially if you're in some little subpage of a subpage on most of your connections, most of the time nobody's doing much of anything. And again, you would love to just not put any resources into stuff that's idle. The flip side of that is if you've got 10,000 connections and as soon as somebody does something you're going to send to all of them, you're actually kind of screwed. Because you have this vast number of connections with this tiny amount of resources working on it. And so if you have to do much of anything, if you've got a bunch of calculating, if everything's going to wake up at once, if you've got a thing where it really just does require a lot of resources, you've set yourself up in a position to promise a lot more resources than you can deliver. One of the nice things about having to have a thread, even a sleeping thread for each of them, is that there's only so much more you can promise than you actually have available. It may get really slow, but you won't have 10,000 connections. Your thread implementation is probably going to stop you at 2,000. It effectively, it may not stop you, but it's probably going to try and do it crawl, and you'll stop allocating more threads for that. You'll say, okay, 2,000 is enough. So, evented programming, you asked about performance and reliability. Performance. If you are in a Node.js style situation, so Node.js is wonderful at things like proxy servers that sit in the middle between two things, because every so often a message will arrive. You'll do something with the message quickly, you'll hand it off, and then you go back to being completely idle. So if it's in the shim layer, the evented approach is wonderful, because you are spending almost none of your time actually running. You're spending a lot of your time with connections open, and you want nothing for those connections. Node.js is fabulous. Yes. When I say Node.js, you should also take Event Machine, which is the Ruby evented implementation, as being good at pretty much exactly the same times. If you'd use Node.js for that, you can also use Event Machine for that. They use the same underlying library in C. They do pretty much the same thing in pretty much the same way. Sorry, and you said add reliability. So if you're thinking of evented as being highly reliable, you're probably thinking of more of the Erlang flavor of it. Erlang is an unusual language in many ways, but almost all of the other weirdness grows out of the fact that it was developed by a telecom company for use on actual telephone lines. It turns out that by contract, they have to supply 5 nines of reliability bare minimum, or they not only don't get paid, they get fined heavily, which means they need 6 nines, randomly, because nothing's ever going to stay at the steady state level of reliability. Reliability goes up, reliability goes down. And if the contractual minimum is 5 nines, you have to be at 6 nines most of the time. So, all Erlang, because it's on Eric's, was used for actual honest-to-God phone lines. They did that early enough that the idea of sticking computer code in the middle of your phone call sounded as insane as it still does to me. You need 5 nines of reliability where they're not interested. I mean, that's not many languages start at that point. And so the whole point of Erlang is you have little servers that pass messages between them and do work, but the messages are all done entirely with copied data. Each message gets its copy and nobody else shares it. So you do it massively parallel, but all those problems with threading, where, oh God, who has references to blah, can we garbage collect?
I think,
no. If it crosses a boundary between execution units, you copy it. Nobody else has a reference to that. You have your own copy of that. When it's done, you get rid of it. And so as a result, if you've got a copy of the stuff that was sent in, you can always kill and restart it. And they do, vigorously, regularly, constantly. Erlang is very big on this process manages this set of smaller processes, manages this set of smaller processes, and if he's got the faintest beginning of a problem, we can be a lot more certain that we're going to get a successful response in 0.05 seconds by starting a whole new tree and killing this tree than waiting for him to figure it out. If you have to figure it out, we're killing you and moving on to the other one. So, Erlang, different approach from how most things do it. The closest thing outside of Erlang that I can tell you that kind of works like that is Scala actors. And I feel bad recommending Scala to anyone for any purpose, but that's personal taste. Anyway, Erlang, genuinely unusual. One of the things that you find when you look at Event Machine or Node.js or any of these other things that kind of try to do the Erlang trick but don't have the trees of processes or the automatic restarts or the fail fast or the lack of delay or any of these other things is that it's really hard to do the Erlang trick without a standard library that is designed specifically for Erlang. If you have slow operations that can kind of grind to a halt so that it's not possible to immediately kill something and restart its replacement, you've got a problem. Except every standard library of almost every programming language is full of operations like that can slow down at random times. File.read. Well, on what file system? Is your drive failing? Is your RAID controller having a bad time? How many retries does your file system have? You don't control these things from Ruby. You don't control these things from almost anywhere. in Erlang, you don't control them, but they'll cheerfully put hard real-time limits on almost everything. So if a bunch of stuff you don't control starts failing, you will still find that all that Erlang style stuff gets killed off and restarted fast enough that if there's any way to satisfy it, they will satisfy it, and if it's not, they will go clean and go fallback. Telephones operate in a very different world of reliability than almost anything a web programmer ever touches. The flip side of that is it's enormous pain in the ass to write code that way. I will not say no web programmer does that. I've gotten to talk to a lot of the MongoDB folks from Guild, and there are absolutely web programmers that do that. Similarly, you can read Release It by Michael Nygaard, which is a sort of enormous, expanded scream of frustration from the ops department for the way developers write code. With a lot of specific, how you can fix this, and it is the source of a lot of big company things like bulkheads in code and circuit breakers in code and these various patterns which if you haven't seen them, again, it's a sign that you're living your life right. Yay. But if you have seen them, there's really not a replacement for them. You either have them or you don't. And it's the same kind of thing. Okay, we've got a service that is failing this large number of times. If we try retries, then what's going to happen is we've got delays and random delays and delays happening repeatedly and we can't kill it. No, here's where we regulate it. And if we start getting flaky errors, here's the number of requests we're willing to have open, here's what our error tolerance is, and if you get beyond the point where you're going to slow other stuff down, you're dead. Here's what our fallback looks like. Here's what our fallback to the fallback looks like. Here's what the static fallback to the fallback looks like, and here's what happens if we can't hit that either. There is a such thing as highly reliable event, and if you live in that world, I don't have to tell you about Erlang because that's where you started, but I would have to tell you about Ruby because you'd be coming here and looking to see if there was any way you could make Ruby that reliable, and the answer is no. Can you make a second thing as reliable as that? There are a lot of theorists who will tell you that Scala actors might be a possibility. I've never seen that happen in practice, but the world is large. Conceivably, Scala might be that reliable someday. But that's actually one reason that Elixir, do people know Elixir? When I say Elixir, some know?
We have that going. We have that going.
It's functional programming similar to Erlang, is it?
It's a different trick. Nothing else really does Erlang's trick. With the hierarchies of processes and the quick restart and the fail fast. You have to have a whole standard library built around it. There's not another way to do it. I don't know a second
To
one.
some extent, it seems like some of the things that Erlang does, now the Docker is actually
I thought it would be.
Docker doesn't guarantee that operations happen quickly or not at all. It's not
you
built
set
that way.
the memory limit, you have some clusters.
Sure, well, and you
have some reliability.
But the problem is that the whole thing has to be built around the idea that you must trust nothing. So like, Docker still kind of assumes the file system is basically the same. It can set some limits, but they're Unix side limits. If your RAID controller controller starts failing, Docker's going to have random flaky failures. It's not going to suddenly go, this is below my minimum requirements, screw you, we're done. Which is what you want for the Erlang approach. Because if there's any way you can fail over to another piece of hardware, you should say as quickly as possible, we're done here. Fail over to another piece of hardware if you've got one, otherwise finish. Serious fail fast of that kind is common nowhere outside of gigantic companies, and Erlang is by far the closest to an off-the-shelf solution for a random programmer to it. The other place that you see that is like Netflix and Google. But you see those folks doing it from the same small number of sources. I mean, you can use their software. Has anyone here had the misfortune to use like high strengths from Netflix or any of the other like serious reliability stuff? Just as well. It is easy to pick up heavily reliable software and think, oh, I'll make my stuff a little better. Which has exactly the same problem as picking up this much auditing process and say, oh, I'll be a little bit more in compliance with financial regulations. That's not how it works. If you have just a little bit of that, what you have is the wrong tool for your job. The only way to use it is to use it uniformly, unfortunately. Reliability is absolutely a weak link in the chain situation, just like security, just like compliance with financial regulations. It turns out whatever the least reliable thing you're doing is, that's how reliable you are. That's fine, but But it means that picking up an extremely ultra-reliable circuit breaker library for retries of HTTP requests, and then affecting nothing else in your system, is kind of the same thing as I'm going to get a solid steel window for the front of my house. Like, one, they're not probably going through the front window. Two, you have a bunch of other windows. And three, if you were to do that with all of your windows and make them solid steel, somebody who cared that much would take a chainsaw to your stucco and would wall. Right? Whatever the weak link is, that's how reliable you are. Anyway, so there is such thing as reliable programming. You won't get it in Ruby. You won't get it almost anywhere, and the odds that you want it in any of the places you can get it are very low. Or again, you will be, not even saying nothing because you're already in a work where you do that and you know more about it than I do, which is entirely possible. You can certainly find the artifacts of that world and really interesting things that look like they may eventually get to where we are. There's some great research papers out of Facebook, which is a phrase I never thought would come out of my mouth. There's some great research papers out of Facebook about retries and queuing, and we have hit that wonderful point in the history of the internet where there is enough internet and enough big queues and enough interesting things going on that it's got some actual theory behind it, and it goes beyond, you know what you need? A bigger buffer. We've hit the point where a lot of the time what you need is not a bigger buffer. Again, I didn't think I'd ever hit that point. I'm glad to hear that it turns out that we have so much research that there's actually a right buffer size. And if you throw more memory at the problem and you're going beyond your right buffer size, you will slow everything down and make it worse rather than better. Right? Anyway, yeah. So you can find the artifacts of people who do these things at this scale and have to worry about reliability at that scale, and you either need a really impressive ops department behind it, because no matter how good your app is going to depend on a lot of things about the computer it runs on, not because you suck, but because that's how apps work. And it turns out guaranteeing those things is hard. And again, it's a problem very much like security. Reliability is something where if you rely on one thing that screws up, that's your level of reliability. In the same way that if you have this, beautiful, gorgeous, decrypting keys thing that you do ahead of time, and then you don't encrypt your swap partition or you allow it to be written to disk, then you get what you deserve on that one. So, evented programming. If you look for things where you've got a whole bunch of idle connections, if you look for things like chat servers, if you look for the kind of thing you use Redis pub sub for, JS for, event machine for, yeah, there's support for that in Ruby. It's a pain in the ass. Doing evented without a library that supports it is a pain in the ass, even if you're not doing the Erlang thing. Event machine is hard to use and kind of annoying. Node.js is less hard to use and annoying because it's built around evented programming. Try to use it for non-evented programming, you'll have the same kind of problem. It's not designed for it. It's not built for it. Try to use something that's built for it. Cool. Has anybody else got open-ended questions or more on that? Or
Question for the audience.
Please.
Has anyone used the AWS WAF, web application firewall? No. It's a lot easier if your site is also on AWS, but I'm hosting it on Linux. So everything has to go through the thing. The WAF has to be used. I want to use the static assets. So there is no any other questions?
Actually, I had a question Noah was talking earlier,
So I think it's, you take
conferences, they were talking about machine learning and it got diverted or something like that. Is Ruby being used for machine learning?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. I normally know Python being used.
Yes. So there are sort of two questions there, and that is Ruby being used to implement machine learning? And the answer is mostly no. And is Ruby being used as a consumer of machine learning for querying that? And the answer is mostly yes. I don't mean it's more Ruby than anything else, but I mean that is absolutely a thing people use Ruby for. So Google Cloud Platform exposes a bunch of the standard Google machine learning algorithms, so face recognition, voice recognition, cutting it up into words, object recognition, finding specific known objects and images, things like that. They have Ruby libraries for a number of those things. Speaking as a guy who for a while led the analytics department at OnLive, don't know any reason you didn't necessarily have heard of OnLive unless you're a gamer. The main reason we use Ruby for a lot of what we use Ruby for is that while high volume things do need usually something other than Ruby, you're going to write one-off queries. You're going to write one-off batch processes, things where your big limit is not the machine execution time, it's the programmer time to write the query. And Ruby's great at that. The other thing is that if you're writing UIs, Rails is wonderful for internal UIs. Because it's not that Ruby is terribly fast. It's not. It's that for a UI, you mostly don't care. It's that for a UI, if the app server is slowing you down, you did it wrong. Generally, the database is the slow thing there. Or in the case of analytics, where you have a lot of non-database tools, still, what's slowing you down is Esper, or what's slowing you down is some other data storage technology, something that is not a general purpose language, but instead is a data storage. Yeah, so Ruby is absolutely being used as a consumer of machine learning stuff and feeding stuff into machine learning stuff. The other thing, and I'll cite some of the really good LinkedIn blog posts about analytics. If you can find anything LinkedIn writes about analytics, it's generally really good quality. 90% of their effort is spent not on writing the code that does the actual churning through the queries. Queries in machine learning are usually pretty simple at this point because that's how complex we've gotten, not very. It's on data cleaning. It's on data quality and figuring out problems, and a lot of that is regular expressions work, and query through a bunch of semi-structured data, and the kind of thing that a Ruby or a Perl type tool is good at, and then something like Java, where you expect everything to already be cleaned and carefully arranged for you, usually isn't. The underlying storage technologies, the underlying query technologies, are often written in C or in Java or in something else that runs faster, but the giant web of scripts that surrounds them is often written in Python or in Ruby. A lot of the code that's written there is basically playing to Ruby's strengths. Now Python is also quite reasonable. You'll find Python is a lot more common in the scientific and mathematical communities as opposed to, say, startup machine learning. And a lot of the reason for that is that if you are writing code that you want to run a long time from now, Python's a better choice than Ruby. Java in turn is a better choice than Python. Java is taking such a hit on development time that you'd rather do Python if you possibly can. It's not a coincidence that Ruby was able to successfully do the 1.8 to 1.9 transition, changing the language substantially and actually get people to move over. And Python is still many years into the Python 2 to Python 3 transition and has never really succeeded. Well, I don't mean that as a slam against them. Ruby is a community where, for all sorts of reasons, but a lot of them have to do with web programming, it's assumed you're going to go through and rewrite your stuff every so often. Like Ruby 1.8 to Ruby 1.9 was a major thing, and you were going to go through and rewrite all your code. But part of that is in web programming. The browsers change out from under us. The standards change out from under us. JavaScript changes all the freaking time. If you have to go in and do maintenance, then by changing your language, you can improve over time. Ruby is a 20-plus-year-old language. Ruby is as old as Python. Ruby is nearly as old as Perl. Rails is about half of Ruby's history. Ruby is old, but things keep getting better. We keep getting tools like Bundler, and everybody starts using them, which is not typical of a 20-year-old language. Python's struggles are pretty liberal for a 20-plus-year-old language. Like, Python's not doing badly. It's just that Ruby is ridiculously fabulous at getting people to go in and change their stuff. And a lot of that is because it's assumed that there's a lot of decay in the places that you use Ruby, like web programming. You're going to have to go in and maintain your stuff or it breaks. That's just how it goes. Even if you wrote it all in C. It's not like C is going to change, but a lot of the underlying standards and stuff are going to change. So write it in whatever language you want. You are going to have to go in and maintain it or it's going to break. And so yeah, when I say that the Python stuff you expect it to run longer, it's a cultural thing. You get to pick. On the far, far end, you have things like Java and COBOL. And by things like Java and COBOL, I mean only Java and COBOL, where it does not change. If you have Java 1.0 bytecode for which you have lost the source code, feed it into modern Java, it runs just fine. I was in college when that came out, and I'm old. Java 1.0 bytecode for which you've lost the source code, it runs. If you've got Java 1.0 source code for which you've lost the bytecode, no problem. Those are two separate things. They support both of them because there are some bugs you can't fix if you keep supporting Java 1.0 source code, and there are other bugs you can't fix if you could still support Java 1.0 bytecode, and they don't fix either set of bugs. Which again, sounds like a dig, and I don't mean it that way. Type erasure. Anybody here use enough Java to know what I mean by type erasure? If so, I'm sorry. It's a terrible, stupid bug that every modern language does better than Java. And it's not that Java is stupid. It's that Java believes backward compatibility is such a powerful value that they'll sacrifice anything else to get it. You know how banks are still running 50-year-old COBOL code? You know why it's only COBOL, not Fortran or other things from that time period? Because COBOL never changed. You can run 50-year-old COBOL code. There is not a second language like that. When there is a second language like that, it will be Java. Really? No, truly. Ruby is the far other end of that spectrum. But yeah, Python is farther in that direction than Ruby. Every other major language is farther in that direction than Ruby. I do not know another major language that changes as quickly or as profoundly as Ruby. And if what you want is for your Ruby code to run forever, that is bad news indeed. No, it's different priorities, it's different values. I love the Ruby community. I am also not trying to run 50-year-old banking code. Certainly not in Ruby. Cool.
So the next meetup, I'm still looking for speakers. If you're interested in speaking, you don't have to be like an expert speaker like Noah here. Whatever you learn, you could have a lightning talk, 5-10 minutes. So if you're interested, just let me know. And when the Google engineer comes back, I'll probably get in touch with him and see June meetup when it's going to be. Before that, I probably might have Ruby Cones where we just work through Jim Weirich thing. You just keep on coding, and as you make the test pass, you will learn more about Ruby, meta-class, and stuff like that. It's got nothing to do with Rails or web application development, but it will be useful. Like you learn something here to troubleshoot, Ruby programs, gems. So knowing those concepts will help you. So that will probably be in the Palo Alto library on Middlefield Road, and probably 2 hours. You won't be able to finish the entire Ruby Commons in 2 hours. It will probably take you 5 hours if you're a beginner, if you haven't done it before. And the thing is, if you spend 2 hours and if you make some progress, there will be enough momentum so you can just do on your own when you go back home and you can just keep working on it. So that's the plan. And that's it for today. I think we're early, 20 minutes early, so giving back your precious time. I think more valuable than giving you back some time.
When I've been saying that I've been doing a bunch of benchmarking stuff, this is what it looks like. I find that if I put a friendly primary colored graph in front of engineers, it's hard for them to resist heckling. So I'm just, waving the red flag in front of the bolts. I'm hoping you'll all go home, have a look at this and give a lot of angry comments about all the stuff I left out. That actually helps me out, so feel very free to.
So how did you create those graphs? Is it like JavaScript, jQuery library, or iCharts?
So it turns out if you type bar chart creator and you go to the, oh man, it's like the 5th link down.
Rapid tables.
Rapid tables. You can type all of this stuff in here and you get something that looks just exactly like what I did.
Do a screen capture and put it in slide.
It turns out it's better than that. This little floppy disk icon, as though someone had 3D printed the save icon. But yeah, it turns out you can save a PNG of it. I didn't realize that. Originally, I was doing screen captures, and I would do the image convert and tell it to trim all the white space off it. But no, it turns out you can just hit the save icon. I didn't see it first either.
Yeah, so if you're learning Rails, right, this is a great example. You could use iCharts behind, and you could have a simple form. If you want to build your own portfolio, this will take all those data, and you just render as image in there, and you could just give a button that will just save the image. It's basically a download an image, whatever the format is. iCharts does all the heavy lifting part. It's just one-page app with all those fields that they can fill out and what type of chart they want. And you just, use iCharts, the JavaScript library. As long as it's not like commercial use, it's free to use. This will be a great portfolio project.
If you start actually caring a lot more about graphing, what I have historically used is Rickshaw from Shutterstock, and it's a little harder to use, but as you can see from, I don't know, can you see? Is it big enough to see? Probably not. But as you can maybe see from the code here, it's not complicated, and this has the advantage of being, a a straightforward little thing you can stick in a browser. So yeah, there are a bunch of good drafting things. And when he says let something else do the heavy lifting, more broadly, when you're building your portfolio, take screenshots of everything. Source code, any kind of output. If you say, that's not my output, I will say, well, if you build a thing related to it, yes it is. Take screenshots. If you work at a defense contractor, obviously there are some potential problems there, but there are also paid lawyers who will address those problems with you personally and confidentially. So in that case, there is a solution. Yeah. So yes, you can certainly do that kind of thing. No, I mean, if you are worried about legal problems with your employer, one, you're usually not actually something they care in the slightest about. Two, that's null and void if they're a defense contractor. Three, if they're a defense contractor, it turns out they have paid lawyers who will talk to you entirely confidentially about what you are and are not allowed to put on your resume that does not violate your security clearance, because this is a problem of long-standing. Cool. All right. Oh, and by the way, if anybody heard him say you could give a talk and immediately said, no, I couldn't, what I would recommend is if you work on code for, let's say, 2 weeks at a go, so some appropriately long time like that, doesn't have to be the same code, any 2 weeks worth of it total. I invite you to think about what you knew then that you didn't know 2 weeks before, and how much you wish you could have known it without spending the 2 weeks on it. That's your target audience. You 2 weeks ago is your target audience. You have found someone who would desperately like to hear what you have just learned. It would make a good talk. That happens every 2 weeks where it should be worked to you specifically and individually, not just to somebody. So whatever you just spent 2 weeks on, pretty good chance it'll make a good talk. Do you need something really complicated for a talk? Well, I just got all you to stand here while I explain constcat about 10 lines. I don't think anybody felt disappointed before I said that.
Yeah, and also I just came across, today I learned, HashRocket as the blog. Today I learned, it's only like 2 paragraphs, that's it. One of the things I worked through was Postgres has this enum, and Rails 5 has this enum thing. You can store, user has a status, silver, gold, platinum, you can define it. It easily stores them into the database, and you can retrieve it and map it automatically in the Rails model. And in just 5 minutes, I worked through it. It's just a 5-minute thing. Define it, you do it, and you go to the console, work through it, and see how it works. That's it. That's a great 5-minute lightning talk. You know?
All right. Now that we've convinced you that everything we do is easy, and really there's not any reason to listen to us in particular, I hope you'll go out and tell all of your friends how amazing this was and how sad they should be that they missed it.
Thank you.